truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Tuesday, September 24th, 2024, the 1,343rd day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening through a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can become a paid subscriber for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will get the ad-free experience. You'll be able to participate in the conversation over on Substack, and you'll be invited to the interactive live stream every Wednesday afternoon. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the free version on Substack, a wide variety of podcast platforms, and of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. Anyone who understands the roller coaster we've been on these past few years knows we haven't reached the end yet, and there may still be hard times to come. And as we add $1 trillion to the national debt every 100 days, we could be headed for some shaky financial times. If you're like me, you're figuring out how to diversify and make sure some seeds are planted for whatever may come. And that's one of the many reasons I think Bitcoin is part of our future. But it's not only about money. Bitcoin looks to be a critical part of the next generation of technology, communications, energy, verification, and even national defense. I'd encourage everyone to do their research and do it now. And if you're convinced of the likelihood that Bitcoin is an essential part of our future, then you'll need an on-ramp. I recommend River. River empowers you to grow your portfolio without any unwanted surprises and eliminates third-party custodians, putting you in control of your assets. Open an account with no minimum purchase requirement. You can get your Bitcoin journey started with just $1. Visit partner.river.com/reasonable to create your River account today. That's partner.river.com/reasonable. Now, I know that many of you out there understand the need to diversify assets, or maybe you're looking to protect your retirement savings, but you're not quite there yet on Bitcoin. And you feel better about precious metals? I get that too. I think going in multiple directions is wise, and I do that myself. And when it comes to buying precious metals, you want to be working with a good company. And that's why I've partnered with Goldco. Goldco is a 6-time Inc. 5000 winner, 2022 Company of the Year, and they've helped people like you and me place over $2 billion in gold and silver. And I have gotten silver from Goldco. And right now they're offering my supporters up to $10,000 in bonus silver while supplies last. Don't pass this offer up. Go to reasonablegold.com now. This is your opportunity to protect you and your family from an out-of-control government before it's too late. So don't wait a second longer. Take action today. Click on the link in the podcast notes or go to reasonablegold.com now and get your free gold kit, your free IRA kit. You'll be glad you did. All right, so let's get started today where we got started yesterday with the latest in the ridiculous unfolding saga surrounding Ryan Routh and assassination attempt number 2. Yesterday, we went through a letter that apparently Ryan Routh wrote by hand months ago and then put in a box. It was about how he had failed everyone by being unable to assassinate Donald Trump. Now, when we discussed this last Monday, the Daily Mail had already published comments from Ryan Routh's son, Orrin Routh, and the comments were fairly strange, not because they're things that a kid wouldn't say, but because they conflict with so many parts of the story we're being told. In exclusive comments to the Daily Mail, he said, "This was the first I'd heard about it. Was my father shot or injured? So he had no idea." He said his father hates Trump as any reasonable person would. He said he doesn't like Trump either, but said his dad's not a violent person and couldn't believe his father would target the president. He said, "He's my dad and all he's had is a couple traffic tickets as far as I know. That's crazy. I know my dad and love my dad, but that's nothing like him." Routh's son believed that he was in Hawaii at the time and not in Florida. He said he was at the beach, but I thought that meant the Outer Banks in Hawaii. I didn't ask him for more information because we'd had a falling out. We've grown apart. He wouldn't explain the nature of their falling out, but still spoke highly of his father. He's not a violent person, he said. He's a hard worker and a great dad. He's a great dude, a nice guy, and has worked his whole effing life. When asked whether or not Ryan Routh owned a gun, the son said, "Not that I know of." He said, "I've never known him to own a gun or known him to do anything batshit like this." And then he ranted about politics for a bit. Both sides are bad, that sort of thing. And that was it. Now, his dad, Ryan Routh, we are told, was arrested for some pretty serious gun charges back in the early 2000s. He was accused of possessing a weapon of mass destruction. And apparently his son has no idea that he's ever owned a gun. His son's 35. He never heard about his dad owning a gun? It's all very strange, and it only gets stranger. In the letter yesterday found inside a box given to the DOJ, apparently by a quote-unquote witness, Routh talked about a $150,000 reward to be paid for assassinating Trump, framing it as though he'd be the one to pay it. He doesn't seem like a guy with $150,000 to spare, so to the extent any of it is true, there would be someone else out there putting a bounty on Trump's head. The story was strange last week. If you want to hear my thoughts on that, go back and listen to the episode last Monday. It has only gotten stranger since, with the story updates mainly consisting of additional detail about things we already knew. Pictures of a gun, for instance. And now, today's update is on Routh's son, Orrin. This is NBC News. Son of Trump assassination plot suspect charged with possession of child sex abuse images. The son of the man accused of plotting to assassinate former President Donald Trump at his golf course has been arrested in connection with a child sex abuse images case. Orrin Alexander Routh was charged in federal court on Monday with one count of receipt of child pornography and one count of possession of child pornography. Court records from the U.S. District Court for the Middle District of North Carolina show that he was arrested Tuesday and that there was no attorney listed for him. Public records show that Orrin Routh is the son of Ryan Wesley Routh, the man authorities believe planned to kill Trump at the former president's golf club in West Palm Beach, Florida on September 15th. Ryan Routh is in custody over two gun-related charges in connection with the alleged assassination plot. The criminal complaint filed against Orrin Routh states that his North Carolina home was searched in connection to an unrelated case. It's unclear if that case was the investigation into his father. According to a criminal complaint, the FBI searched Orrin Routh's home in North Carolina on Saturday. A review of an SD card in a Samsung phone found in his bedroom allegedly uncovered hundreds of files containing child sex abuse images. Files included videos from a quote-unquote known series that includes videos of an adult man with a quote-unquote prepubescent girl under the age of 10. Apologies, this is disgusting. The complaint said a second Samsung phone was found in Orrin Routh's possession, according to the complaint, and included a downloaded folder with additional video files. Investigators reported that they observed one video of an adult woman with a girl aged 6 to 8. Again, apologies. The complaint also said investigators found a messaging app on the phone that is, quote, commonly used by individuals who distribute and receive child pornography, end quote. The person who sent the messages from the phone asked for a preview of digital content being sold, according to the complaint. 2 files were then sent. Both included adults engaging in sexual acts with minors, the complaint said. A warrant for his arrest was filed in federal court Monday. Court records show that Orrin Routh is in federal custody. As of Tuesday morning, a preliminary hearing had not been scheduled and he had not entered a plea. All right, now it goes without saying that content is an abomination, and people in that situation should be held to account to the full extent of the law. People have mixed feelings about capital punishment in general, but it seems like that should be one of the crimes when that becomes totally appropriate. This isn't a subject anyone likes spending a whole lot of time on, but I've talked about before, I think one of the most horrific parts of this particular crime is that someone so young can then be totally scarred for life. It takes away the person's ability to have normal relationships. And of course, we can hope that that's not always the case, but to expose a child to the absolute devastation of the world at such a young age, it's an absolutely horrific crime. All of that should go without saying. But in addition to that, there are also examples of law enforcement planting child pornography on people's devices. And going by nothing more than that description, it sounds like all that would have to happen is someone hacks into a phone and sends a text message that appears from that phone number with a payment to follow, and that illicit, disgusting content ends up back on the phone. Now, I don't know if that's the case here, and I have absolutely no reason to defend Orrin Routh. If this is the sort of thing he's actually into, I hope he's put away, and if capital punishment is appropriate, so be it. But we're in the middle of an information war, and this is one of the weirdest narratives that we've seen in the last 4+ years. He gives exclusive comments to the Daily Mail a week ago. Strange comments. Seems like he doesn't really know what's going on with his dad, which should remind everyone of that Thomas Matthew Crooks character from Assassination Event Number 1, whose parents don't seem to know him at all. The kid has no internet history whatsoever. It is acceptable to ask if we're just being fed lines of bullshit about these tense, emotional, explosive events in the lead up to an election that people are absolutely losing their minds over. If we're engaging with this level of absurdity and not asking questions, we're doing it wrong. These aren't the things to be the least skeptical about. These are the things to be the most skeptical about. The people on TV are spending days picking apart fake news polls. That's not necessary. Those are totally fake, and they're not important at all. This is important, and people are generally not skeptical because the event as reported is upsetting, and people want to hear about how justice will be done every day in the mainstream media. Pump this story out, now we know his son is evil, and that makes total sense for the way they've described this patsy. His phone was searched by the feds for an unrelated case, and they checked his phones and the SD cards on his phones? I mean, if the case is about the distributor of child pornography and they were tracking every phone number where that content had been sent, okay. And if there's some involvement with this assassination event number 2, okay. And I'm totally down to believe that both Ryan Routh and his son, Orrin Routh, to the extent that either of them are real people, are very evil. But right now, what we have is the bad guys telling us who's a bad guy. I won't believe any of these people about anything. This is the same justice system and the same media that covers up for pedophiles all the time. What if this Orrin Routh character knows a few things that might not be so good for them? What a good way to shut him up. What a good way to discredit him. Everything about this is suspect, and you can see the way that the mainstream media has handled these narratives. I can't find anything about this in the New York Post, or in the Washington Post for that matter. I guess they didn't hear the news, or maybe they thought it wasn't important enough to report, or maybe they don't want that sort of thing being seen by their readers. their readers are still being fed a regular dose of Trump would-be assassins are doing something wrong, but their heart's in the right place. It can't be that the details are too murky. I mean, they reported the Russia hoax and the Ukraine hoax for that matter, and the fake election and the very violent insurrection and all of the rest of it. All of it wrong. All of it wrong when they printed it, and no apologies whatsoever. They haven't even given back their Pulitzers. The Washington Post's reporting on assassination event number 2 and Ryan Routh is very light, and it's highlighted by this piece, an op-ed from Malcolm Nance, the former Intel clown, MSNBC character, and frequent guest on Bill Maher's show, who toward the beginning of the very brutal invasion traveled over to Ukraine to join their foreign legion and then began taking selfie videos to send back home so they could be aired on the news. He faked witnessing a bombing run one day. It was very embarrassing. But he wrote an op-ed at the end of last week with the headline, "Ukraine has been a magnet for unstable characters like Ryan Routh." Yeah, you've got to separate those Ukrainian Nazis from the unstable characters like Ryan Routh. Nance discusses his time over there in the International Legion. Now, Nance is a highly trained fighting machine who just so happens to be really, really good at news. And, of course, heroic enough to help out the comedic actor and his band of Ukrainian Nazis. He wrote in this article, again, many foreign NGOs in Ukraine do good work and necessary work, helping hospitals, providing ambulances, supporting drone purchases, but plenty of others simply don't have a role to play and either cannot or will not return home. Unlike the rough conditions of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, Ukraine, even now, is a functioning Western society with inexpensive restaurants and comfortable cafes where volunteers can sit and pretend they're part of the fight to defend democracy and repel a vicious invader. So, are you saying that the people pretending to do that aren't actually in a brutal war zone defending freedom and democracy? They're just hanging out at comfortable cafes? What am I saying? That's just a conspiracy theory. The members of the International Legion swore an oath to the Ukrainian government, passed the vetting, and deployed to combat zones. We drew the same salary as the lowest Ukrainian soldier, and for the first 6 months of the war, that meant zero pay. The Legion has more than 1,000 fighters in 4 battalions. I returned to the United States at the end of 2022 and had a foundation to support its work. What a selfless hero Malcolm Nance is. I guess the first 6 months they had to wait for the Biden bucks to be transferred through FTX and finally make it to the ground so that Malcolm Nance and some other globalist mercenaries could get paid to defend the global regime. He goes on. Yes, we've had our share of people who tricked the vetting teams and were admitted. The Legion has had to eject some bad apples, including an American wanted in a double homicide in Florida and an Australian financial fraudster. One young former U.S. Army soldier turned out to be mentally unstable and wasn't allowed near a weapon. In each instance, the person was found out and removed quickly from the service. So, sometimes a bad apple slips through. A guy who's wanted for double homicide, someone who's committed financial crimes, Ryan Routh. But for the most part, it's just a great bunch of guys over there supporting some Ukrainian Nazis, and the cause is worth it. I mean, sure, he tried to assassinate the president. And historic supporter of Ukrainian Nazis, Lindsey Graham, was right out there on the front lines telling everybody that it definitely happened last Sunday afternoon. But you don't want Ukraine to look bad. Donald Trump released an official statement yesterday about assassination event number 2. It reads, breaking. The Kamala Harris/Joe Biden Department of Justice and FBI are mishandling and downplaying the second assassination attempt on my life since July. The charges brought against the maniac assassin are a slap on the wrist. It's no wonder, since the DOJ and FBI have been coming after me nonstop with weaponized lawfare since I announced my first historic campaign for the presidency. From Russia, 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 Ukraine, 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 Iran, 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 impeachment hoax number 1, impeachment hoax number 2, to the lawless documents hoax brought after an illegal and unconstitutional raid of my home, on which I am suing the DOJ for their wrongful acts, to the January 6th hoax in Washington, D.C., where the J6 Unselect Committee illegally deleted and destroyed all documents, the Manhattan DA's zombie case, the New York AG scam, illegally spying on my campaign, to censoring the Hunter Biden laptop from hell, which was criminally led by the fake 51 intelligence officials who lied and claimed it was, quote, Russian interference and disinformation, while the laptop was, in fact, Hunter Biden, not Russia, and exposed Crooked Joe and his family for their decades of grift, and many lawless, radical attacks against their political opponent, me. The DOJ and FBI have a conflict of interest since they have been obsessed with, quote unquote, getting Trump for so long. It's very difficult to trust the Biden-Harris DOJ and FBI to investigate the assassination attempts due to election interference and the fake cases brought against me, including their control over local DAs and AGs. Shockingly, after the bullet went through my ear on that fateful day in Butler, Pennsylvania, the FBI director went before Congress and falsely said that it may not have been a bullet. It was just glass or shrapnel. A lie condemned by even my worst enemies. What he said was disgraceful, especially since it was witnessed live by millions of people, and he was forced to immediately retract. If the DOJ and FBI cannot do their job honestly and without bias and hold the aspiring assassin responsible to the full extent of the law, Governor Ron DeSantis and the state of Florida have already agreed to take the lead on the investigation and prosecution. Florida charges would be much more serious than the ones the FBI has announced. The truth would be followed wherever it leads. Our justice system is corrupt and discredited, especially as it pertains to the 45th president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. Let Florida handle the case. And for sure, Ron DeSantis would preside over all of it with the highest honor and integrity, just like he did when he was running his fake campaign in the fake primary, pretending Joe Biden was a legitimate president and that he was the way of the future for the Republican Party. It's weird that they still have rigged and stolen elections in Florida, but I'm sure it's not Ron DeSantis' fault. I mean, what could he have done about it besides call for their elections to be thoroughly reviewed in every aspect? But he didn't do that. Instead, he just started up a state election review board that answers to him. And then he ran for re-election in Florida while already intending to run for president. Ron DeSantis, he's the man. Trump's statement is an all-out assault on the DOJ and FBI, bringing up all of the hoaxes over the past 9 years. Now, I've said many times over the last few years, you have to apply good twin, evil twin to everything. It's entirely possible that within the FBI and within the DOJ, there really are either ghosts in the machine or substantial factions who are doing their jobs honorably for the benefit of this country and its people. What we see on television and read in the newspapers and online is not always a reflection of the entire organization. And some of you might remember that Donald Trump's first stop after being sworn in as president in 2017 was CIA headquarters, where he essentially delivered a similar message to the CIA. To the extent there are ghosts in the machine or some good faction within these organizations, Trump going on the attack against the organization in its entirety so frequently provides a lot of cover, narratively speaking, for whoever in these organizations might be faithfully doing good work on behalf of the American people. Trump's role is manipulating the narrative, but not so everybody does what he says. It's so that everyone has the discussion and the collective consciousness finds some sort of equilibrium across an entire range of issues. I talked about this in an episode a couple of months ago called Divider in Chief. Trump proposes an idea, any idea. The Trump haters attack that idea in order to attack Donald Trump. They say everything that could possibly be bad about that idea. And then because everyone knows they're liars and no one actually takes them seriously, the backlash to whatever position they support leads the conversation in the other direction. And Trump doesn't do this only with the uniparty left, though he does it primarily with and to them. He also does it to the uniparty right. Trump put 3 justices on the Supreme Court, and they overturned Roe v. Wade, and abortion is now a decision for the states. Trump supports the exceptions the same way Reagan did: rape, incest, and life of the mother. But all of the uniparty right figures who are Trump deranged immediately attacked him for that, as if it's Trump's responsibility as president, after already having done the only thing he can and should do, is to toe the line with Pro-Life Incorporated and protect their controlled opposition dynamic. Now, I know that position doesn't appeal to everyone. If you have a different position, argue your position. Convince people you're right. Change the culture. Don't look for Donald Trump to fix it for you. He's in the process of helping the country discover what it actually believes about a whole range of issues by having the real conversation in public through the use of all these different templates, all these different stories, these narratives that we watch play out in the news over months or years. Every aspect is bickered over and debated, and eventually people come to learn the principles in all of these stories and their points of view relative to those principles. I would suggest the same thing may be occurring here with this statement, and I think it's a way to view the entire story surrounding assassination attempt number 2. See it as a template for all of these other issues to rise to the surface. Maybe it's an indicator of a sad state of affairs in our society right now, but it requires a really big story to get some of these ideas in front of a mainstream news audience filled with clueless standard issue villagers who spend their days arguing about fake news and fake polls and fake celebrity relationships and which of their favorite influencers on their favorite legacy social media apps is fighting some other influencer. For decades, we were fed bad information in an eye-catching, entertaining, emotionally gripping package. And now, the counter attempt is to feed good information in an eye-catching, entertaining, emotionally gripping package. And the thing to consider is whether or not all of that is justified. Is it okay to create from nothing an eye-catching, entertaining, emotionally gripping narrative to communicate necessary information that would otherwise be ignored? If the medicine is true, is it necessary for the spoonful of sugar to be true as well? Or can it just be sugar? Is it okay to over-exaggerate a story so that people learn the lesson they've been ignoring throughout their entire lives? Is it okay to tell the country that something that happened 6 years ago is actually happening right now in real time and portray it to the country that way? In early 2022, the overwhelming majority of people in this country had no idea that Ukraine had been engaged in an ethnic civil war for, at that point, 8 years, or that they've had a Nazi problem that goes back 8 decades. No one paid attention as the war was being waged. No one paid attention to the corruption in Ukraine. Malcolm Nance just told us about all the comfortable cafes where people who don't quite have the right stuff to be in the International Legion can go spend their days pretending to be as strong and brave as Malcolm Nance. They had U2 go to Kyiv to perform in a subway tunnel under the guise of being concerned about all the dropping bombs. Something doesn't quite fit. Is it okay if we're told the story about the ethnic civil war in Ukraine, the regime versus Russia in this proxy battle, years after it ended, once everybody's paying attention? I'm not asserting that's what happened, but if it is it justified? Think about that with the immigration situation. I know illegal aliens are a problem. I lived in Los Angeles, and then I lived in Austin, Texas. It's not something you can miss. I'm certainly not denying that they ship people leaving the same country to the same city in the United States. Ilhan Omar's Minneapolis is a perfect example. That's where the Somalian immigrants are shipped. This sort of thing has even been reported in the New York Times. And of course, that problem has been ongoing for decades. It's never been the focus like it is now. The drug trafficking, the weapons trafficking, the human trafficking, gang-related crimes, these things have been going on in major cities around the country, particularly in the southern border states, although the problem is clearly more pervasive than that. But it's been happening for a long time. Would it be okay to portray that to the country in a condensed version that exposes the long-term magnitude of the problem in a very short period of time, even more intensely, to communicate that magnitude? I was thinking about some of this morning in relation to polls and the polling that's been out recently since Kamala Harris, quote unquote, entered the race for real president in this totally real campaign. Most mornings, I'll go on a bunch of different mainstream and regime-oriented websites, check the headlines, see what they're pushing, read whatever looks like it has the chance of providing some signal and not just more noise. And on CNN's front page, they have a big story about how there's no clear leader in the race between Harris and Trump. Poll finds showing Kamala Harris up nationally 48-47. That's not possible. That's absurd. But that's what they're pitching. The Economist, which is one of the official mouthpieces of the regime, and particularly the Rothschilds, they own a 26% stake in the outlet. They have what they call a model that shows Kamala Harris up by 4 points, 50.3% to 46.3%. They describe their methodology at the bottom of the article. Their approach treats each poll as an imperfect estimate of some true support for each candidate. A statistical model is used to estimate the quote-unquote true voting intention given recent polls. The model takes into account differences in methodology between polls and the partisan tilt of individual polling firms' output. Basically, they take a collection of things that are already made up and already beset with all those same problems, these estimations, these guesses, these preferences on how things should be. And then they take those guesses and throw them into their own model that makes more guesses with more assumptions about how things are and how they should be. They basically just stick a number on their opinion in order to influence narratives. And it's funny because there was a piece in the American Prospect this morning from Robert Kuttner called Polling Whiplash that describes this exact dynamic. And we're not going to go through all of this, but if you follow poll results, you were probably suffering from the latest roller coaster whiplash. Yesterday, NBC released a poll with astonishingly good news for the Harris-Walz campaign. Harris is up by 5 points nationally, 49-44. More importantly, her approval-disapproval score has improved by a record 21 points, from 50% negative versus 32 positive in July to 48% positive against 45 negative in mid-September. Trump, meanwhile, has descended further into negative approval territory, and Harris gained significantly among Black and Hispanic voters. But then, the dawn's early light brought this depressing news from the New York Times Siena poll. Trump is ahead and has actually gained ground in the key battleground states of Arizona and Georgia and is slightly ahead in North Carolina. How can both polls be accurate? They can't. Here I turn to the indispensable wisdom of Michael Podorzer, who astutely points out that all polling is quote-unquote opinion journalism. Why? Because pollsters make assumptions about who is a likely voter and how to weigh or overweigh different demographic groups. The opinions are not just about issues or ideology, but about methodological approaches, he writes. And we will leave this article there. But the truth is, it's actually even much worse than that, because the polls want to match themselves to the reported results of elections, assuming those elections are real. But they're not real. They're fake. They also use voter registration statistics in order to weight polls. But the voter registration statistics are also fake because the voter rolls in the states contain thousands, hundreds of thousands, and sometimes millions of ineligible voters. Illegal aliens who were automatically registered at the DMV, dead people, people who have moved away, people who've changed addresses and now have 2 voter registrations. The voter rolls provide the raw materials for the election fraud system. They're basically all inflated dramatically. And they can do that because they always tell you it's a percentage of the total population in the United States according to the census. But the census counts everyone here, not just American citizens. Do they take that out when they're discussing the percentage of the eligible population? Nope, they sure don't, because the Uniparty fought Trump in court over a citizenship question on the census. Even if all of the pollsters were doing an honest job to the best of their ability, all of this work would still be totally invalid. It's especially silly because we know of the presence of that great cloud in the sky that has absolutely all of our data and analyzes it via algorithm nonstop 24 hours a day and has for many years and probably a lot longer than we imagine. They know what everybody's going to vote for. They don't actually need polls to find out what the people think. I've talked about this before, suggesting Donald Trump knows exactly where majority opinion is on any matter at any moment. That's what having all of the information all the time can enable. The polls are ridiculous. The polls are fake. The polls are nothing more than narrative devices. Joe Biden lost by a lot in 2020. And Donald Trump is far more popular now than he ever was then. In fact, Donald Trump is doing much stronger even in those same polls than he was then. You can go back to 2016 and Hillary Clinton was up double digits at this point. The polls are a sham, and most people understand this by now. You can look in the comments on polling, reporting, or people commenting on the polls, and we're at the point where the people in the comments are saying, polls are fake, this is not a close race, why are you talking about this? That's not only true, it's an important message to push, because when people try to get you to fall in line and exploit your anxieties about the political situation in this country by claiming that we are right now involved in a very close, very real election, those people should be laughed at. They should be told there is no reason to believe that the election is close at all, and certainly not based on the fake news polls. And so here's how I was thinking of all that in relation to immigration. We've talked many times about what I think of the uniparty left media and how they treat their own audience. The same is true, though maybe not to the same extent, for the uniparty right media. They need to create a critical mass consensus. They need to shift collective belief. And as a byproduct of that, what they are doing is inculcating entire belief systems that will actually be very, very harmful for their audience members, but very productive for their needs and the needs of the uniparty, the needs of the global regime. These people are moral relativists who have convinced themselves that their organization does good work, and it's necessary for them to be saying the things they say because the political project requires it, and ultimately that political project is the most important thing. Rachel Maddow doesn't care that she's lying to her audience because she's a communist and a very serious intellectual who thinks that she knows better than other people how those people should live. And because they can't figure it out for themselves how they should live or how they would want to live, Rachel Maddow is then justified in deceiving them so that her allies in the regime can be empowered to make those people's lives better. And if their lives don't happen to get better, well, it's not her fault. She was deceiving them for their own good. Now think about that in relation to these polls. Many of these polls carry with them the imprimatur of being scientific polls. They're not like those unscientific polls on Twitter. These are the scientific polls where they respect statistical processes, but also make everything else up. A scientific poll that produces numbers is called data, and data constitutes evidence. Data actually constitutes an argument in itself from the perspective of these communists. And therefore, anything that people could observe in the world or come to as an act of pure reason is invalidated because they have data. They have hard numbers. And of course, they're objective and nonpartisan, not like you with all your biases. And sure, they guess about things and adjust whatever they have to and then normalize their output to multiple other fraudulent data sets. But that's not bias, that's just incomplete science. But consider what this means for some of the people that I was discussing yesterday, not in the Hollywood segment, but when I was talking about Mike Benz and his conversation with Sean Ryan, coming to the realization that Sean Ryan had never heard any of the things that Mike Benz was saying. He had never thought about any of these ideas about what's actually happening in the world. I talked about how this is an enormous problem, not only societally and spiritually for the individual, but economically. This is putting people's livelihoods at risk, the fact that they have no understanding of what is happening at a deeper level. They have no idea how the world is shifting. They haven't even incorporated the fundamental truth that our elections are incapable of producing legitimate results and therefore incapable of producing legitimate governments. And so, of course, they have no idea that anything is being done about that and that all the people involved may end up being held accountable. I suggested that is very likely a multi-billion or multi-trillion-dollar problem and talked about how that's the product of a bad and polluted information stream. But think about how that problem looks from one level up beyond wherever these people are. However elite, however quote-unquote successful or wealthy they might be, unless you're really in that elite club, there are people above you who need you to continue believing the lies that are propagated by the mainstream media. They need people fully attached to the central narrative so that they don't realize anything has actually gone wrong or could go wrong. They need to keep everything functioning business as usual. Because if people steer off course, well, then all of a sudden they might make decisions that begin to harm the system at large. And as people discover that their own personal interests, the interests of their family or their company, are not aligned with what's actually happening, they will make changes. Those changes will further weaken whoever might be above them in a particular hierarchy. I used the example yesterday of a company that produces some good that is sold primarily at Walmart or some similar store. If that big store was to collapse under the weight of its complicity in crimes against America or crimes against humanity, that company would immediately lose its primary customer and might have to itself go out of business. There would be a chain reaction. That's why if you're a person or an entity that is dependent on parts of the regime for your livelihood, you would want to catch up to what is actually happening in order to gauge however much risk you might be exposed to. But the same can be true from the opposite direction. If you take, for example, Walmart or a similar company who has engaged in some very bad behavior, you would want to keep that from all your distributors. You would want to tell all your distributors that everything's fine, because if they realized it wasn't, they might change their behavior. Then that would affect your business. And so because of the current incentive and punishment structure, you have this symbiotic relationship, this codependence that will eventually end up like a sinking ship and a scramble to get to the last lifeboat, only for both parties to find out all the lifeboats are gone. Now, the problem is that company that supplies goods that are sold at some major retailer, they're not going to have all the information. That's going to end up being speculation. And the major retailer's not going to tell them. The major retailer is like Rachel Maddow. They're doing their job to keep the system running, and they need all their vendors to keep their systems running the same too. Donald Trump did an interview last night with Cheryl Atkinson. She's an independent journalist who claims that her husband was a victim of what I described earlier, government actors making illegal intrusions into their devices. She and her husband actually sued Eric Holder and the U.S. government, named and unnamed defendants, for this exact activity. And of course, I'm sure it's only a coincidence that Trump was on with Atkinson last night and this story about Ryan Routh's son comes out today. And make of this clip what you will, but Trump does mention that people really don't know what's happening.
Consequential president, so in that way it's a very nice honor, but it's true. I mean, I was a very consequential president and would certainly be, and maybe even more so this time, because I understand the system, I understand countries, I understand who rips us and who doesn't, and a lot of people don't. A lot of people don't have a clue. They don't even know what's happening. And I think that I will feel safe. I think I'm going to feel safe.
Are you ever scared?
I can't be scared, because if you're scared, you can't do your job. So I just can't be.
He says he knows about the government. He understands systems. He knows about the other countries. A lot of people don't. They have no clue. They have no idea what's happening. People who don't pay any attention to this stuff always think that Trump is just shooting his mouth off or babbling. He doesn't know what he's saying. Trump knows exactly what he's saying. People have no idea what's happening geopolitically in the world right now. And to be clear, no one knows that completely. There is an information problem inherent in that idea itself. But there are very few people who have even pursued the bodies of knowledge in which answers to these questions lie. They ignore them completely because they're told they're off limits. They're conspiracy theories. They're not serious. They conflict with history. They're going to make you think or say bad things. Whatever it is, people ignore it. One of those people is Kamala Harris, by the way. You could not possibly convince me that Kamala Harris has any clue what's happening anywhere in the world. Kamala Harris's job probably requires a similar level of responsibility to that of the people Malcolm Nance described who didn't get into the International Legion and now just hang out at cafes talking about how someday they're really going to Slava Ukraini. Trump then said this last night at a speech in Pennsylvania.
This about Russia. Under Bush, they took a lot. Under Biden and Barack Hussein Obama, has anyone ever heard of him? Barack Hussein, a lot of people say he's actually running the country right now. I don't think so. I don't think so. But some people say he's running our country. But I don't think it's Biden. Under Barack Hussein Obama, they took a lot, right? Under Biden, they're taking everything. They're taking everything. This is Russia. They're taking everything. I mean,
so Biden's definitely not running things. People think it's Obama, but Trump doesn't think so. It's not Barack Hussein Obama. And honestly, thinking it's Barack Obama is a little silly. Obama is certainly conducting business on some level, but he's not some kind of ultimate decision maker. The country, to the extent it's being run by, quote unquote, the federal government at all, is just being run by the executive branch agencies and the sprawling federal bureaucracy. The military conducts its own business, and the truth is that the military may have been conducting much of the country's business for far longer than we know. Colonel Wilkerson, last week on Judge Napolitano's show, talked about how it's common practice for the military to conduct our foreign policy, and then went into an explanation of how the combatant commanders are not letting Joe Biden give permission to Ukraine to use long-range weapons that can strike inside Russia, and are not allowing Israel to expand its war in the Middle East, though they're all doing their best. These people are not in control, and the fact that virtually no one understands that has created that significant knowledge gap. That is allowed to persist because people and entities that interface constantly with the global regime and rely on the global regime for the structure of their business, the structure of their lives, they're all incentivized not to know. And so I was thinking about this idea in relation to immigration, because at some point, when immigrants who have come here illegally understand that, yeah, actually, Donald Trump is coming back, Donald Trump is going to be the guy in control, and he has promised a mass deportation, people will likely be better off self-deporting. Now, at some point, those people will come to this understanding en masse, but they could understand it now. I'm not sure. I'm not part of an illegal alien community, but you'd have to think that there are whispers, murmurs, rumors, and the smart ones are preparing to jump ship, but it'll happen eventually. And at that point, That process will probably create substantial chaos that the regime will then look to exploit, whether it's just through the media or through destabilization efforts wherever these illegal aliens happen to be. Trump discussed the deportations last night with Cheryl Atkinson as well.
Put one wrong person onto a bus or onto an airplane, and your radical left lunatics will try and make it sound like the worst thing that's ever happened. But we're getting the criminals out, and we're going to do that fast, and we know who they are. The local police know their names, and they know their serial numbers. They know everything about them. We work with the local police, the local law enforcement, which is great all throughout the country. But we have to get, look, we have people, we have murderers that have been let into our country. They're not going to get better. We have people that are insane, that their mental institutions are, the mental institutions all over the world have a much lower population, and in many cases, they've been emptied out. The jails are down to much lower numbers, and soon they'll be emptied out. They're emptying out into the United States of America. We're not a dumping ground. We're going to get all of those people out, and we're going to get them out fast.
He just said he's working with local police and that they know the names, they know the serial numbers, they know everything. And of course, they have various other identity markers as well, including and especially biometrics. The job is doable. Trump is committed to doing it, and America wants Trump to do it. So it's very likely that that's going to happen if Trump, quote unquote, wins this fake election. But of course, the election's not actually close. So if the TV tells us that Kamala won, that doesn't really mean anything more than when Joe Biden won. The country will understand, just as they understood in 2020, but hopefully people who claim to be patriotic Americans, people who claim to care about this country, won't ignore it this time. They won't silence themselves. They won't tell everybody that maybe it's for the best. We'll just ride it out for 4 years and things will be okay. Maybe they'll recognize the usurpation of the most powerful country on earth for what it is. And I do expect that to happen. Because I expect that if the TV says Kamala won, it's going to be pretty obvious that it was stolen. By that time, it will be, narratively speaking, far too big to rig. As I've said a number of times now, I'm not convinced that we're going to get to that point before the entire election charade in this country goes belly up. They might just cancel it. But one way or another, we are going to get to that point where that deportation effort is in full gear, which means at some point prior to that, the illegal aliens in this country who will be deported may decide it would be smarter to scramble for the border. The only reason that hasn't happened so far is because the polls still show a close election. And the TV says this is going to be a close election. And people haven't incorporated the idea, the understanding that actually we don't have legitimate elections in this country. We have rigged elections. We have fraudulent elections. We have stolen elections. Our elections are a farce. And if the elections are a farce and the people running the country, the people running the elections, the politicians themselves and the voters all know that each election is a farce, then we don't actually have elections. We have a bunch of people participating in a collective self-delusion. And as that gets resolved narratively, the people with actual control will decide it's time for Trump to resume his role as the publicly recognized president of the United States of America. And at that point, of course, a whole different kind of work will begin. But consider what it would be like if people weren't told the election was close, if people were told the true state of things. And I believe the true state of things is that the number of people prepared to go out and support Donald Trump against this regime and everything it stands for is definitely upwards of 60%. And if you told me it was upwards of 80%, I would not be surprised. The election fraud apparatus was forced to create 28 million extra ballots worth of turnout in 2020 over 2016 with no possible explanation for how that happened. And then we were told Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. Donald Trump was hated, but somehow upped his vote total from 2016 to 2020 by nearly 20%. How can he be the most hated person in the country and grow more popular over his 4 years as president? It couldn't have been that bad. He couldn't be that hated. Donald Trump has grown far more popular since then. People understand Joe Biden didn't get 81 million real lawful American votes. They understand that the very violent insurrection was yet another hoax. They're not happy about the vaccine mandates and how all that turned out, many of them having already injected themselves with a toxic experimental substance that can't protect them from a disease that can't kill them. They're not happy with what's going on in Ukraine or in Israel. They weren't happy with the Afghanistan withdrawal. They're not happy with the economy or with immigration. Kamala Harris had no support in her 2019 primary. She was the least popular vice president ever, and everything that she was reported to be involved with has turned into a disaster in this country. Her history is terrible. Her record is terrible. She's running a joy-based, vibes-based campaign that itself is an astroturfed contrivance. She doesn't sit down for interviews. She reads scripts, and she's a devout communist who cackles like a maniac. She's doing everything so poorly, it looks like she's trying to be replaced, and she might be. The country rejected Joe Biden, and now no one has any idea of who the president is. Yet people believe it's a close race. Now, if you understand that, you can better map the possibilities in the future. If you understand that the election is fake in the first place, that makes it much easier. But even people who understand that the narrative will reach a point where it is too big to rig, there is no way that any rational person would believe there's any chance Donald Trump could lose. If he then does lose, the response should not be, oh, now we've got Kamala Harris for 4 years, otherwise civil war. The response should be, oh, wow, everybody's going to now understand that our elections are stolen. So whatever's been happening in the background over these last many years, that's going to begin to become visible, maybe in the form of new elections monitored by the Marines or the National Guard, or maybe in the form of exposing the consistent pattern of fraud, the crime and abuse against America and against humanity, and something more direct must be done. I would guess that the narrative will be massaged for whatever amount of time it takes to provide a smooth transition out of this phase. And as Mike Pompeo said during the transition period after the 2020 election into the next Trump term, what would it look like if the polls said that Trump was up 65-30 or 70-28? People would act in dramatically different ways. People would make significantly different life choices. People who've been exploited by the global regime would feel new confidence in the future, whereas people on the other side of that would understand that their worst fears actually are coming true and they are going to be held accountable for what they've done. The same idea as when a Hollywood celebrity closely connected to Diddy understands, oh, wait, they're not just coming for Diddy. People need that information, but they're not seeking it out. And if they stumble upon it somehow, they often reject it because it doesn't come backed by the authorities they trust. And so again, you have that symbiotic, that codependent relationship between the ignorant and those who are keeping them ignorant. Consider the magnitude of this fraud, of this narrative manipulation, and consider the cruelty. And this isn't some unusual dynamic. This is standard operating procedure. A company that's collapsing will tell its own investors so they can get their money out and leave small retail investors holding the bag. Same concept. The idea that this is a real election, that it's a close race, that these polls are describing some certain aspect of reality prime, all of that is a desperate attempt to preserve the system as it is. And of course, all of this rests on the farcical notion that we are somehow a 50-50 country. Fake statistics, fake polls, fake elections, people willing to lie about it, and people willing to believe the lie because they need the liars. The withholding of this information is going to cause additional chaos, and in fact, it's designed to, and they're already planning for it. The Washington Post is now just engaging in journalistic terrorism at this point. Here's a headline from Friday. Scarred by violence, lawmakers plan for possible mass casualty event. Imagine the unthinkable, a mass shooting of members of Congress that leaves a large swath of the country unrepresented and shifts the balance of power in Washington. In the current political environment, such an outbreak of violence is not as unthinkable as it used to be, according to a bipartisan collection of House members. The attempted assassination of members at a congressional baseball team practice in 2017, the violent attack on the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021, a dramatic spike in threats against members, and most recently, a possible second assassination attempt against former President Donald Trump highlight the need for Congress to ensure it can continue to govern in the aftermath of mass violence, they said. And that's strange, isn't it? 4 days after assassination event number 2, and Washington Post doesn't even know if it was a real assassination attempt or not. I thought that this was the real objective news. Doesn't Jeff Bezos own the Washington Post? Do they not have the resources to get to the bottom of these stories? What's happening here? These are the people who got to the bottom of Russiagate and said it was true. Are they assassination deniers? That sounds like a conspiracy theory. It seems like something for which they should be censored online. To address such a scenario, these 4 House members, 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, are pushing an unlikely solution, a constitutional amendment that would allow members to be replaced quickly in the event of a mass casualty event. In addition to ensuring uninterrupted representation for constituents, the amendment would discourage attempts to use violence to sway the balance of power in the House. We've seen a 300% increase in threats against members over the last 7 years, according to the Capitol Police, said Representative Derek Kilmer, Democrat of Washington, one of 4 lawmakers pushing the issue. Ah, yes, the Capitol Police, Nancy Pelosi's private Praetorian Guard. Those are the guys who helped stage the very violent insurrection of January 6, 2021. We can trust them. Also, a 300% increase could mean it went from 1,000 threats to 3,000 threats, or it could mean it went from 1 threat to 3 threats. What a ridiculous assertion. In an environment where we have seen a growing tendency toward political violence, imagine, horrifically, a baseball practice where someone has bad intentions and better aim. You can literally flip a majority for 3 to 4 months, which I think is a frightening incentive for political violence. Yeah, especially when you're advertising your imagined horrors as a smart political strategy. According to a survey of state election officials, states need between 3 and 4 months on average to hold a special election to replace a deceased House member, a function of the time it takes to print ballots, in addition to a federal law requiring ballots to be mailed to overseasoned military voters at least 45 days ahead of an election. And, about that, those rules are all going to have to go. That's actually a really long time to have a vacancy if you're in the midst of a national crisis, Kilmer said. Kilmer teamed up with Representatives Brad Wenstrup, Republican of Ohio, William Timmons, Republican of South Carolina, and Emanuel Cleaver II, Democrat of Missouri, to come up with a proposal to ensure that Congress can continue its work if a large number of members are killed in a mass attack. Their proposed constitutional amendment would require each member of the House to submit the names of at least 5 individuals from his or her political party to their state's governor. In the event of that representative's death, the governor would choose a name from the list within 10 days, and the House Speaker would be required to seat them immediately. Now, that is one of the dumbest things I've ever heard. It's also extraordinarily undemocratic and obviously, because they need an amendment, unconstitutional. It's also pretty easy to see how that could be immediately leveraged. Mind-blowing stuff here. The quote-unquote continuity amendment would also deny a would-be assassin the power to flip control of the House from one party to another, Kilmer said. The interim appointee would serve only till a special election could take place. The Constitution requires all House vacancies to be filled by election rather than with an interim appointment. It does not impose the same standard on the Senate, where states may choose to fill vacancies with a temporary appointment until a special election can take place. And pause for a second to consider what this would look like in a world with fake elections, because that's the real world. Someone is placed into that position and then immediately runs as an incumbent, and with fake elections can simply be selected as the winner. Enacting a constitutional amendment is difficult, requiring a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, as well as ratification by 3/4 of state legislatures. The last ratification took place in 1992 when the 27th Amendment was adopted, requiring that any pay raise enacted by Congress for itself may not go into effect until after the next election. And oh, what an important amendment that is. I bet the American people could not wait for that to finally be ratified. Congress should eliminate the incentive for an individual to commit political violence for the purpose of tipping the balance of power, Wenstrup argued at a Committee on House Administration subcommittee hearing on the measure Wednesday. A violent domestic terrorist attempted to assassinate Republican members of Congress. Wenstrup, who treated House Majority Whip Steve Scalise after he was shot during the congressional baseball team attack, recalled of the shooting. He had names in his pocket, descriptions in his pocket. This was a clear assassination attempt, and he decided to use murder or assassination as a tool for political change. He wanted to wipe out the Republican majority and change the balance of power. Yeah, Bernie supporters are a little radical. I would contend that's an insurrection by one person, Wenstrup added. Oh, what an interesting introduction of terms. Both Kilmer and Wenstrup are retiring at the end of this year, and the chances the amendment could pass through a narrowly divided Congress is slim. 40 constitutional amendments have been introduced since 1945, and none of them have passed. Representative Stephanie Bice, the chairwoman of the subcommittee, noted in her opening remarks. Bice said the track record helped explain why, in the wake of the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, Congress opted instead to change federal law requiring a state hold a special election within 49 days in the event of an extraordinary circumstance where vacancies in the House chamber exceed 100 seats. And that is very interesting. What are they anticipating? Are they anticipating the possibility of a massive number of members of Congress simply being removed, which at some point they absolutely must be? Kind of sounds that way. 9 states have laws for holding special elections to fill House vacancies that are consistent with federal law that requires a special election to be held within 49 days of a vacancy, according to Rebecca Gambler, director of the Government Accountability Office's Homeland Security and Justice Division. But 41 states do not have such laws, and some officials, responding to a GAO survey, expressed concern about their ability to hold an election in such a tight time frame. Well, yeah, it's really tough to get the whole election fraud apparatus functioning properly on a condensed timeline like that. Maybe they're anticipating having to have another election with no officials whatsoever in the federal government, which is what I've been calling for since January of 2021. Only 27 states have responded to the survey so far, Gambler said, but some state election officials reported that, quote, it would be difficult to select candidates within the time frame required by the law. Oh, gosh, what an unsolvable problem that is. Officials noted challenges related to preparing and printing ballots, identifying polling places and poll workers, and transmitting absentee ballots to military and overseas voters, said Gambler, who added that some election officials alternatively provided suggestions and best practices on how to hold a special election in such a tight time frame. A final report will be issued in the coming months. In the 21st century, it's naive to imagine that we could never face the situation that motivates the proposal, said Richard Primus, a constitutional law professor at the University of Michigan. So they asked some guy for his opinion about whether or not there might be a mass casualty event? Very journalism. Primus added, though, that if thwarting acts of violence intended to flip the balance of power is the goal, lawmakers should also consider changing the Presidential Succession Act, which includes the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore of the Senate in the line of succession. It is often the case that they are of a different political party from the president, he said. So apparently they want to be certain that, for whatever reason, if all of a sudden there is a mass vacancy in the House of Representatives, whoever ends up filling their position until a special election can be held will be of the same party as the person leaving. Now, the Congress was Article 1 of the Constitution because the Congress is meant to be closest to the people, particularly the House of Representatives. House members were only intended to be representing 30,000 people each, and obviously the regime decided that's of no concern. That would require far too many representatives. It would be impossible to get them all on the same page. So instead, we have members of Congress who represent hundreds and hundreds of thousands of constituents, which is basically like representing zero constituents at all, or maybe more accurately, one total constituent, which is that same global regime. But this process intends to leave the people out completely and gives the Uniparty the option of making sure their own candidates would be installed. And above all else, it prioritizes keeping the government functioning when the American people really don't want the government to be functioning anymore. And what a justification they are using to push this through. Not that it will get through, of course it won't, but there's a reason they're pressing this conversation, and there are plausible realities that could emerge where we might see massive vacancies in the House of Representatives. It should be assumed that none of them are legitimately elected, and there's a strong chance that many of them are guilty of crimes against America or conspiracy to commit crimes against America. And of course, the same is true for crimes against humanity, and for many of them, it's probably true of war crimes as well. But hey, at least they found a way to exploit the assassination events. All right, so tomorrow's interactive live stream on Rumble will be at 3 p.m. Eastern. At some point tomorrow, you will receive a link to that live stream in a Substack post. And as for this podcast, I will be back on Thursday at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening for free and would like to support the show, the best way to do that is by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can find the info stream over on Telegram at t.me/veryreasonable. The merch site is cancelcouture.com, and for all my other links, you can visit linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon. Down on the range.